Hi, Mom Togs, and welcome to Exposure 101. This is for Mommy's Gonna Snap Facebook group by me, Elizabeth Robinette. I am the owner and lead photographer of Ginger Snap Studio based out of Florence, Arizona, about an hour outside of Phoenix. This will be kind of a part two for you if you took look at the initial exposure video, but I thought that it might be a little bit better for you to actually see on the screen in words what I'm talking about, along with some graphics, and maybe that would be a little bit better than me just talking to you. So, trying something new, let's continue on. The exposure triangle. Understanding the elements that make up exposure. We talked about this in the previous video, and what I've done for here is just broken it up into an actual triangle so that you can see exposure is created by aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Aperture controls the amount of light that can enter your camera and the depth of field, how blurry your background will be. Shutter speed controls the length of time that you're exposing your image and the amount of light that reaches the sensor of your camera. ISO controls how sensitive your camera is to that light. Please note that high ISOs can result in grain and noise, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later. Your aperture. This is commonly referred to as your f-stop or your f-number. Setting the f-stop controls how much light you are letting through the lens into your camera. Your f-stop also controls the depth of field of your image, i.e. how much of your image will be in focus. The lower your f-number, the more focus will be on your subject, the blurrier your background will be, and the more light you are letting through your lens into your camera. Therefore, the brighter your picture will be. Shooting at your lowest f-stop or f-number is commonly referred to as shooting wide open. The higher your aperture or your f-number, the less focus will be on your subject, the more in focus your background will be, and the less light that you are letting through your lens and your camera, so the darker your picture will be. You can see on this little graphic here, we've got higher f-number and all that information there for you, so give you a nice visual. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is so important when we're talking about pictures of anything that moves. If you've seen those beautiful light painted pictures with the sparklers, sports shots where the motion just completely freezes, or you're trying to capture images of your fast moving toddler, these scenarios are really where shutter speed mastery comes in handy. I will tell you minimum recommended shutter speed for shooting pictures of your children is 1/150th of a second. You don't want to go any slower than that, or you're going to have motion blur because they are wiggly, wiggly little creatures. So that's my recommendation there. So the higher your shutter speed, the faster the shutter on your camera closes. The faster the shutter closes, the less light is getting into your camera, and the sharper your subjects are going to be. The lower the shutter speed, the slower the shutter closes, and the more light is let into your camera. You're going to use a slow shutter for more light, objects with blur, fast shutter, less light, quick moving objects. ISO. ISO works by telling your camera how to interpret light. It helps to brighten up your photos, add extra light when you need it the most, such as being indoors on a cloudy day. Typically, your camera is going to have a max ISO that it can handle with minimal noise. Noise is that grainy, pixelated look to your pictures. You've probably seen it when you take pictures of your kids in a restaurant and it's really dark with your phone. You don't get enough light for there to be a crystal clear picture. So all of that little grain and stuff is what we call noise. On lower end DSLRs, this can be as low as 600 to 800 ISO, and I know that that's a pain, but really until you get into much more expensive cameras, you don't have a high max. And it is unfortunate, but you just have to know how to set your exposure to compensate for that, which is what this class is all about. So, ISO, be careful with it. The higher your ISO, the more light you can add, but the more grain and noise you'll add. The lower your ISO, the less light you're adding and the less grain. I personally, indoors, even on a cloudy day, try not to bump my ISO above 400. I have a tendency to shoot wide open, so I typically never have to bump my ISO beyond 400. And that's just personal preference for clarity and sharpness of my images. You really have to know your individual camera and play with your camera and get to know what it's capable of, what your lenses are capable of. All of it just takes practice, 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 practice. If there's one thing I can encourage you to do, it's to take all this information and start playing with it, because that is how you are going to learn. You need to play with these settings, figure out how they interact with each other, what your camera seems to like, what it doesn't like, what you don't like, and just feel it out. I really, really believe that photography is best learned by practical learning and hands-on learning, where you're taking this information and fiddling with it and, say a prayer and hope for the best. But trial by fire is photography learning, because that's the only way you're going to learn. You can read as many books and online articles and take as many classes like this as you want, but unless you're putting all of that information into practice where it starts to click in your brain and you start to understand how all these elements play with each other, it's not going to do you any good. So please, please, please practice. Here are some basic rules to get you started. These rules are set for different exposure situations. In the snow and sand, f/22, 1/125th of a second, 100 ISO. Sunny days, partial sun, overcast, gloomy, backlight. You can see all of them there. This is a really, really great thing to look up. You can find printable sheets on Pinterest to print off for the Sunny 16 rule. Carry it with you, and like I said, practice, practice, practice. I know it seems intimidating. It's so much information, but you can do this. Trust me, I did. I self-taught myself from the very beginning, and I didn't have a lot of help. I didn't have someone awesome like me in my life helping me figure this out. I did it all on my own, and 4 years in, I'm now able to help teach other people. So, yay! Just know that you can do this. All right. Next thing we need to talk about when it comes to exposure, and I hinted at this at the end of the last video, is your light meter, the metering modes on your camera, and also why your camera can be a big fat liar. How do you know if you are exposing properly? Well, this has to do with your light meter. When you look through the viewfinder of your camera, you're going to see what looks like bars, and I've put a little icon picture right here for you. You will know that your image is properly exposed when the bottom or top of the bars, depending on your camera make and model, line up with the 0. If you go towards the minus symbol on the left side, your image is considered underexposed. If you go towards the plus symbol on the right side, your image is overexposed. Now, a lot of photographers will shoot 1 or 2 notches underexposed or 1 or 2 notches overexposed, depending on their personal preference and editing style. I tend to shoot 1 to 2 notches underexposed because I like to post-process and play with the light in my image and the light on my subject and do all sorts of fancy, complicated things that I won't go into here. But that's my preference. You may find that you like completely exposing your image right at 0, and I think when you're starting out, this is a really, really good thing to do. But do know that if you underexpose it a little bit or overexpose it a little bit, that is stuff that you can play with in post, and you may find you like to do that. So get comfortable with shooting a completely properly exposed image and then play with the variety that the world offers you. Now, this is great. We know that our light meter is going to tell us that we are getting a good exposure when we get to that 0 mark, but how does your camera know where it's reading the exposure? Well, this varies between cameras. On my Nikon D750, the metering point where the camera reads the exposure, is the same as the focal point where I'm focusing my shot. On some cameras, it's the center point only. You need to refer to your camera's manual to make sure you know where your camera is reading that exposure, because your light meter is not going to do you a bit of good if you are pointing your camera at your pretty little toddler who's sitting in a corner with a teddy bear, but your camera is metering, all the way to the right by the couch or something. You need to make sure that you know where your camera is metering from so that you can expose properly. Metering modes. This is the last little bit that's super important as you get started. Your camera has different metering modes. In other words, this is different ways that your camera is going to measure the light from the metering point to tell your light meter what that exposure looks like. There are three main types of metering modes. Matrix mode. I think this is called something different on Canon, but I'm not a Canon girl, so look it up and Google it. Center weighted metering mode and spot metering mode. And these little symbols are what they look like on your camera or something very similar to it. Again, refer to your camera's manual because there's so many different ones. I cannot possibly go into all of them. Matrix metering mode. This analyzes the entire scene to determine exposure by dividing the frame into zones. It reads each zone, finds an average between the zones. It also considers the focal point, distance to the subject, colors of the scene. It all plays a factor in determining the exposure. So you can kind of think of this mode as a default. It's going to read everything in the scene, decide how the exposure would look best, and tell your light meter you're too dark or you're too bright because of this, and allow you to adjust for the entire scene. Suggested use for this metering mode are scenes that are nice and evenly lit. Say you've got a cloudy day or you're indoors on a cloudy day, that sort of thing. Outing or events where you need to capture shots quickly. This is also best if you're not comfortable with the idea of messing with your metering mode. Do not feel like you have to change your metering mode while you're learning the rest of the stuff. You can stick with this one. It's fine. It's the default. It's not going to steer you wrong for the most part. Okay? Center weighted metering mode. This is the mode that the camera judges the entire scene, but it's giving the priority to the center of the frame. This is the most common metering mode in point and shoot cameras because it's giving that priority to the center. And where do we tend to put our subjects? In the middle of the frame. By the way, I will be putting another video on here when we start talking about composition, about getting your subject out of the middle of your frame. It's something that we all do, but there are reasons that you want to get your subject out of the middle of the frame. But that's another class for another time. Suggested use: portraits, especially headshots, where your subject is always going to be in the center of the frame. It's great for those. Outdoor portraits where the exposure of your subject is more important than the background. This is especially important if you're trying to get that perfect silhouette shot, that sort of thing. This is really, really, really great metering mode for that. Now, spot metering mode. This metering mode analyzes the light in one spot. It's either the center on some cameras, or it's the focal point, like on my camera, and it uses that to determine the exposure. This is most commonly used by professional photographers, as it allows you to control the light, or the metering of the light in a specific spot. Spot metering modes is going to analyze the light around 1 to 5% of the total overall frame of the image. So this is really great if you want to ensure that your subject is properly exposed in high contrast scenes, backlit shots. If you're shooting your subject at a distance and you're wanting to make sure that your subject is exposed properly, this is how you are going to do it, because you can narrow that focus point or that or your metering point on your subject from a distance. And since it's a 1 to 5% of the total frame exposure reading, you're going to get your subject perfectly exposed. This is also great for macro photography where you're shooting things that are super duper up close, and also if you're shooting the moon. Very, very important to use spot metering for shooting the moon. If we used Matrix to analyze the entire scene, your camera is going to tell you to shoot the moon in a way that it's just going to look like a giant blob of light in the frame. So try this one and take a picture of the moon. Shooting the moon is a lot of fun. Night photography is fun. Do it. All right. Last little bit when it comes to metering modes, exposure compensation. Sometimes your light meter and your metering modes, while they do their best, they're dirty little liars, and they're consistently going to tell you to overexpose or underexpose your image. You can tell your camera to get a grip and compensate for this by setting an exposure compensation value to either increase or decrease the exposure. This is really, really helpful, particularly if you're shooting snowy scenes, beaches, and backlit shots. Because snow and white sand on beaches and all the light and backlit shots pour additional light into your camera, it's going to actually trick your equipment. If you're also shooting something really high contrast, like a white dog against a black background, again, your camera could be tricked by this just because of the white acts like a reflector, and your camera is also going to read all that black and think, well, there's really dark shadows and really white highlights, and we need to compensate for that, and it's going to go completely crazy, and it's going to give you a shot where the dog looks gray, most likely. So if you find that that's happening, tell your camera you're the boss and set an exposure compensation value, either to make it more exposed or less exposed, and use the back of your camera as a guide to see if what you're shooting you're happy with. And that is exposure compensation. So any questions? I'm sure you've got them. If you do, put them in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this class, click subscribe and you'll get notified for the next.